Terry Thomas is a retired U.S. Army captain with 23 years in aviation, transportation, and logistics. He has a bachelor's degree in aviation maintenance management, an FAA airplane mechanic license, an MBA in MIS, and a project management professional certification. He's been very busy. He began his genealogy research in the 1980s with his Thomas family, which were Georgia residents since the 1750s. And then he moved on and expanded into his and his late wife's families as well. He began client research in 2008 and presenting in 2015. And he operates the website atlantagenealogy.com. A ProGen 38 graduate, he is the current president of the Genealogical Speakers Guild, a member of numerous genealogical and historical societies, and he serves on several boards. He's also occasionally worked for the TV show Finding Your Roots, if you're all familiar with that, and was credited on the Julia Roberts and the Terry Crews episodes. Mr. Thomas is no stranger to us here at the Georgia Archives, so everyone please help me in welcoming him to back here.
Thank you, Robin. Just a little bit more about me so you understand where I come from and my background, and I hate staying behind these things, but it's being recorded, so I'll have to behave. I tell people I'm northern born, I'm southern bred. As you heard, my Thomas line have been in Georgia since the 1750s. Mama was in Acres, like Acres Mill, but not the rich business branch, the poor Baptist preacher branch. Grew up a hillbilly in Alabama. They met and married in Chicago, which is where I graduated high school. And a week later, the house was packed in U-Hauls and we moved to Florida. And then I joined that small company called the U.S. Army for the next 23 years. Ending up here in 96, anybody familiar with the Chicago area, 98, they asked me to go to Great Lakes, or north of Great Lakes. And I went, nope, not going back north. I found my home in Georgia. So we're going to talk about Georgia and being 250th anniversary of our great country. And as she mentioned, and I've also did the Rita Dove episode. I enjoy doing the work for them. What I don't like about the show is they don't explain how many that we're doing this 2 years before it's presented and how many thousands of hours are involved and how many researchers. So this is being recorded. You can watch it later on YouTube, but I put this up typically because, this is how we make our money. So moving on. Those who've been to any of my presentations know I always start with a disclaimer of some sort. And this one is history is what history was. We're genealogists, which means we're historians. We can't change the past. We can't whitewash it. We can't rewrite it, but we treat it with proper respect and proper context. But you better believe we're going to get every scrap of information from any document we find, no matter how ugly that document is. That's important. And it was mostly a man's world, but you can find the women sometimes, particularly if they own the land, because the little tax collector wants their money. All right. And this isn't intended to be any kind of in-depth, but to provide kind of an information overview. But the same thing pretty much applying to all the states. One of the things that's really unique about Georgia is just how young it was as a colony. Founded in 1733, and 40 years later, we're in a war. Just about, look for independence. Which meant we lacked the deep generational roots that was in the other states. There were fewer longstanding churches, courts, and civic bodies, and many residents were first-generation arrivals. This youth explains why it was thin or late-forming records. And one of the things I've mentioned, John Adams was our first Secretary of State, and he sat down and had tea with General Oglethorpe after the war. That's how young Georgia was. Georgia was the last frontier of the time. It was set up initially to be a buffer between the South Carolinians and the Spaniards in Florida. And there were a lot of skirmishes over the decades. And like I said, many of the residents were new arrivals, and it was newly formed civil government. The settlements mainly formed along the rivers and were ethnically clustered. So from Augusta, maybe 60 miles wide, down to about 100 miles wide at Savannah. That was it. That was Georgia. And Britain was tired of all this conflict along the southern frontier. That's when they started the colony of Georgia. And it was, like I said, buffer zone. So there was strong royal government and loyalist influence. The failed trusteeship was from 1733 to 1753. And on paper, the royal government stood up in 1754, but it was really more like late 1755 before they really got anything going. So you had almost 4 years of what I call controlled chaos. Now, is that why my ancestor moved us to Georgia then? I don't know. Maybe it could be, but they moved in right in the middle of that. There had been a couple of royal governors, and then came Governor James Wright. He was popular. They liked him. He kept a lot of British's garbage off the backs of the Georgians. So the people had more control than they did under the trustees, and they pretty much liked the guy. And that stability explains why the royal loyalty lingered longer in Georgia than the other colonies. So Georgia was a latecomer to the Revolution. You know, we didn't attend the first Continental Congress, joined at the second. Governmental picture revolutionary Georgia was not what we have now. And the absence of organized protest delayed revolutionary consequences in Georgia. We sat Lyman Hall as a delegate representing St. John's Parish, but strictly as the parish, not as representing the state. Later, Button Gwinnett and George Walton also joined. So about the time of the Revolution, it's estimated about 15 to 20% of Georgia, of the white colonists, were loyal to the king. And the committed patriots is estimated to be around 40 and 45%, with the rest kind of just, I'm watching out to see who wins this thing. I'm staying as neutral as I can. So the commitment evolved as the war reached the South. More the war started coming south, the more Georgia got involved. Some of the heroes, and we're going to look at a bunch of these individually, so we're not going to go over the whole list now. Some of these are familiar faces, but they have different documentary trail. This one you need to understand about researching during the Revolutionary War, either in Georgia or somewhere else. The stories highlight how the record will vary. By the way, before I forget, there are handouts. We ran out. If you want one, we're going to do a sign-up sheet afterwards. Give us your email and we'll send you the handout. But we're going to start with Button Gwinnett, one of the famous leaders. He was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, but his role was strictly civil and legislative, not military. So you're not going to find military records on this guy. You're going to find him in the civil and the legal system. That's, you know, when we start looking at our ancestors, we're looking for patriots. They didn't all put on a uniform. That's the point. He was also president of Georgia for 6 months. The way the Constitution originally ran is whoever was equivalent to the Speaker of the House was the governor or president and served a 6-month term. His story also foreshadows something more important, which we're going to come to in a little bit, the internal conflict among patriots themselves, not between patriots and loyalists. John Houston, and this is why the county is called Houston. See how it's spelled? O-U-O-U. All right. He also represented the political side, not the military service. During the Revolution, he attended the Second Continental Congress and later served as governor of Georgia, leaving a record trail in the civil and executive records rather than muster rolls. For genealogists, again, he's a reminder, revolutionary participation is often documented outside military service. Now, here's something important, so you understand where this story is going to go. He married General Lackland McIntosh's sister. Okay? And his sister married General Lackland McIntosh's younger brother. It's a family affair. Okay. Colonel Elijah Clark is one of our patriots. He was a militia guy, which means it's not going to be at NERA. It'll be right here. Most of the stuff on him. The militia had been around since the trusteeship. Militia has always been around in the colonies because they were the ones that were to defend that community against any aggression. So we expect from Continental troops one set of records, but his was not. They were raised locally, served intermittently, and often left scattered or delayed documentation. Much of Clark's fighting occurred in the backcountry, where the war was frequently neighbor against neighbor, generating court cases and later claims rather than clean muster rolls. For researchers, Clark is a reminder that militia service is often proven indirectly and after the fact, not through a single military record. One of the key things about him is he was one of them that was signing the warrants for veterans so they could get the bounty land. And if you gave them enough cash, you suddenly became a veteran, whether you served or not. So in the book that they have downstairs, Georgia's in the Revolution, and talks about the bounty land grants, there's like 5-6 pages that are not useful for joining DAR or SAR. Because there are some of them that are in question. You still have to prove they've served. Now we get to General Lackland McIntosh. He was Continental Line, which means it's more narrow. There's some stuff here. So it's going to be more federal and department records. He was a major influence after the war. The problem comes, there's more than one Lackland McIntosh. Nobody's written an authoritative book on the McIntosh family. One of my early clients, and I never did talk to the client, I talked to her good friend and lawyer. I just somebody famous in Georgia. Who? Yeah, good luck with that one. I seem to remember the name McIntosh. Turns out she descends from that marriage between Lackland's younger brother and the Housing girl. Okay. Not every McIntosh in Georgia is this McIntosh family. And like I said, researchers still have to prove identity through time, place, and associates. Georgia's leadership was not always unified, though. McIntosh's political conflict was with Button Gwinnett. Button Gwinnett, when he was governor, ruined Joe Lackland McIntosh's younger brother, politically, financially, civilly. Which is one of the reasons that Button Gwinnett and Lackland McIntosh had a duel, and Button Gwinnett died. Okay, there was internal strife, not just between the Loyalists and the Patriots. Austin Dabney. Austin Dabney was an enslaved man who served as a Patriot soldier. He's the only one recorded in Georgia to be granted manumission after the war because of his service. He was wounded in service, commonly associated with the Battle of Kettle Creek. And Georgia later formally recognized his service, taking the extraordinary step of granting emancipation by law. This is a legislative act. This isn't his former enslaver freeing him. This is the state stepping in. And I think that was like 6 pages of it. They have it downstairs. For his recognition, created a clear documentary trail of service, legislation, land, and later records. His case shows why proof often requires crossing jurisdictions and record types, because it's in different counties around Georgia. He appears in records through service, land, and later documentation. We have to cross sometimes state lines to find our records. Nancy Hart. How many have heard the story of Nancy Hart? Okay, handful of you. Folklore versus evidence. It's a great story. Whether it's true or not, don't know. But the story goes like this. It survives primarily as tradition and later retellings. Legend says that a group of Tories or Loyalists, depending on who's telling the story, arrived at her family cabin looking for Patriot activity. She fed them, and while they were eating and drinking, she slowly removed their muskets out of the room. So there was one left and held them at gunpoint. Supposedly one of them charged her, she shot him. And she held on to them till the Patriots and her family got there and they were hung. Oh, this is over the Broad River frontier near Walhatchee Creek in what is now Elbert County, Georgia. And in 1912, railroad excavation near her cabin uncovered 5 or 6 skeletons, some with broken necks. That gives more evidence to the legend. But we can't prove it. So it's a legend. And a lot of times we doing genealogy work, we come across stories and is it true? Don't know. Can't prove it. All right. And not so heroes. Colonel John Thomas, no relation. Right off the bat, no relation. My ancestor was Gilshot Thomas. His father was John Thomas, but John never left Delaware. He was a patriot and then turned loyalist. He lived in Burke County, moved to Georgia from Virginia. That's another reason I know he ain't kin. All right, my family was in Maryland and Delaware. Like I said, not the father of Gilshot or the grandfather of Gilshot Jr. There are many such cases like this. So you find people that switch parties. And these choices create court and confiscation records. Records may appear after the war, not during. Okay. I love this book, Recollections of a Georgia Loyalist. This young girl was 16, married a British lieutenant in Savannah just before the war. And it talks about their exploits trying to, during the war and trying to get out of Georgia before they got caught. They eventually landed in Canada. Now, when I say Georgia was small, there's that narrow strip again, but we had a bunch of skirmishes. So you have some direct military service, support for the cause of refugees. We're going to talk more about each of these. But the participation took many different forms, not just combat. Fighting was regional, not everywhere, and where conflict occurred shaped who participated. One of these is the Battle of Briar Creek. Now, the gentleman I met a number of years ago, he wrote a book about the Battle of Briar Creek. I accidentally offended him, and I was not challenging his research whatsoever. But the battle was 3 plantations away from Gilshot, my ancestor. My family's not involved. Now, they may have been hiding in South Carolina at the time, but he got offended that I was challenging his work. I'm like, no, not at all. It's just I am surprised that they're not, because I know Junior and James get involved later on in the war. So we're looking for direct military service. We got to understand whether it's Continental Line or militia service, short-term and local service, or the long-term. Why many soldiers never appear in any role. And just because there's an absence of service records does not mean they were not involved in some way. So when we talk about the Continental Line, that's actually the Army. I put Navy and Marines up here also. They were not Continental Line, but they were part of the federal regiment assigned by state. This was longer, regular federal service like you think of today. This young man here did some number of years in the Air Force, and I did a bunch in the Army. By the way, any other veterans in here? Thank you all. So include Army regiments and related federal service, more standardized pay and service documentation. There's more for the ones that served in the Continental Line, the Marines and the Navy than there is the militia. More likely to generate pension files too. And service could occur outside the home state. General Lackland McIntosh was in Virginia later on. So you have to look. The militia service, as we mentioned, that was local. That was just usually temporary. Been around, like I said, since the trustees, and they were called out as needed. So we've all seen a bunch of Revolutionary War movies, and they're calling up the militia. Often missing or fragmentary documentation because it was all locally generated and kept locally. And the records appear, like I said, some of the records here's one of the key things. If they were an officer, there's a good chance they've got a record downstairs because the commission was from the state. It's state 100%. I said there's a good chance. It's worth looking into. And you'll see it when you're doing looking at tax records and sometimes census records. It'll say a militia district and who the commander was. All right. Why this matters to genealogists? Men often served in both at different times. Some served militia, then the line, then back in the militia, depending on how long they enlisted. Yet they may never appear in federal roles. This is actually a recruitment one from Central Virginia. One that I was working on for a client. But again, just because they're not on the rolls doesn't mean they didn't serve. You have to look. The context determines where the records survive. You have to understand the structure to prevent false negatives. There's other ways. Support for the cause that could be economic and practical. Supply goods to the for services. Produced or managed supplies. Provided transport, shelter troops, provided labor. There's a lot of different ways. And this is where you might find the Quakers. Because the Quakers didn't take up arms, but they supported the cause. Okay. Oaths of allegiance. Now, I don't know of any in Georgia. I've found any of that, but in some places they did oath of allegiance. That counts. Served in civil organizations under the state. Signed petitions. Refused jury duty. So Gilshot refused to sit on a jury with the state. Newspapers and correspondence at different places we're going to look to see what we can find on the ancestors or person we are researching. So they're not often as clear. You sometimes have to dig. You're probably never going to find anything about spies unless they admitted it after the war. But there is a lot of intelligence activities going on. So there are stories. I mean, there were stories of enslaved people who were illiterate and served as spies, not in Georgia. This is in other states, because they weren't thinking to see if they could read what was being written. Editors, editorials, you might find stuff there, and other informal communication. Refugees, displacement and experience. Families displaced by the British occupation, raids, confiscation, and fear of reprisal. And like I said, with the Battle of Briar Creek, Gilshot may have taken his family and gone to South Carolina. Loss of home, crops, livestock, and personal property sometimes happen. And so the refugee status might explain why there's a gap in some of the records, like tax and land, court records. Individuals often reappear later in another county or colony or state. So you all look to see if there's any kind of petitions that were signed, whether they filed a claim for loss of cattle or whatever from their property. Look for gaps in the records and out-of-state records sometimes during their flight. There's a civil war going on inside Georgia. If you think about it, when you're talking about the Loyalists and the Tories, these are neighbors against neighbors. Retaliation was happening on both sides. Civilian violence drives court records. You might find some of those court records, and explains why the testimony survives. You might find stuff in memoirs, pension applications, and newspaper stories. So one of the books, and this is in the handouts, just Google Tarleton Brown memoirs. He was a captain in the American Revolution with the militia, served for a while with Francis Marion. Vivid account of the raids and Tory encounters along the Georgia-South Carolina border. It's a short read. He was a neighbor of my family. My family was literally on the Savannah River. His was on the other side. And he writes, although the war had closed, the Tories were still troublesome, plundering and occasionally killing the inhabitants. I got 3 other men, Richard Simmons, Gil Thomas, and Benjamin Brown, and put out after them. Gil is junior, Gilshot Jr. Okay. Took these people and they went and they chased these Tories all the way into eastern Tennessee, captured some, killed some. One that got away later gets arrested for murder and hung. So why were records lost and confusing? Sometimes we had 2 governments going on. We had the British government. The British were in Georgia until after the war. They were only kicked out briefly, and the Governor Wright came back with a bunch of troops and retook Savannah. So we got 2 governments. We got the American government. We got the British government. So you have to look at both. And when you go downstairs, if you go look, the colonial records of Georgia, there's also the state records. We've got those downstairs too. And I saw something on a trivia show, and I thought the whole question was stupid. Which state in the United States had the most state capitals? And they said Georgia, because everywhere they met during the war, they called that the capital. That was not the capital. Okay, people, please. You know, this week they were at my house. Next week they're at your house. You know, please. But it makes it hard to maintain records. Makes it hard to not lose them and keep track of what we've got. They said Governor Wright fled Savannah from February of '76, but he came back shortly. Actually, no, he came back in December of 78. So not quite 2 years. He was gone, but he's back. They recaptured Savannah. So the Loyalist allegiance explains the absence of Patriot service, and loyalty oaths and lists document the Crown supporters. Their service may appear in the British and civil records over yonder. But neighbor hostilities generate petitions, like I said, testimonies, and led to confiscation. So John Thomas got his land confiscated and kicked out of the state. He later appealed and came back. And that's what we're talking about here. And he was allowed back in Georgia, but he was not given his land back. That's your punishment there. So they were declared traitors. Like I said, they were chased out of the state. You're going to have records. You're going to have testimonies. And Gil Thomas is one of them giving testimony. And I remember seeing somewhere where it showed that his father, because it said old Gil shot. But I can't seem to find that, which goes back to cite your sources. One of the things I did not learn early on in my pursuit is keeping track of where I found stuff. Some, like said, John Thomas pled for relief or return after the war. And these are name-rich, relationship-rich records that are great if you can find them. What we need to do, we have to explain the gaps. We have to correlate indirect evidence. So we might get a piece over here and a piece over here. And we're trying to piece all together like a puzzle without knowing what it's going to look like when we're done. You got to follow the people, not the places. Use the fan club, the friends, acquaintances, neighbors. Look at who they're associated with, who they're hanging around with. I mean, when I read in Charlton Brown's memoirs, Gil Thomas, I got excited. Because at the time, I was still trying to prove he existed. Okay? But I found I have all the proof I need. I'm going to show you in a little bit. Look in surrounding counties. And understand one thing about Georgia, which we're going to get into. There's people that stayed in the same piece of property for 50 years, and they were in 3 different counties. Mm-hmm. I'm doing research for a client now on some land that was originally Henry, then DeKalb, and now Fulton. So I'm going to researching in 3 different county records. Like I said, county boundaries and jurisdictions change rapidly. Records may exist in neighboring or parent counties. Follow the person, not the county, and use geography to explain record gaps and movements. Again, the fan-based research is very essential here. So what this client has been looking for is she descends from like 6 families that had these land lots. And so, revolutionary service often occurred in one place. Proof often exists somewhere else. So in some cases, I found the pension because they moved to Illinois. That's where the pension was filed. They didn't stay put. Revolutionary service and consequences often followed people west and south. Later records may created decades later in different states. The war destroyed the local economy. So there's some devastation, so they may not be able to farm that land anymore, so they moved. Land shortages pushed families west. There was a new colony, still remembers, less than 50 years old. Everybody's having babies. They grow up, they want to move, they want their own place. And veterans follow opportunity, not memory. Many veterans received bounty land for their service, and a lot of that is recorded in the land lotteries downstairs. But a lot of them won the land and immediately sold it. That's free money. They didn't want to move. Gilshot Jr. won land in Washington County, but he sold it and got more land in Burke County. Oh, Georgia, imagine west. Georgia, as you can see originally, it and North Carolina went all the way to the Mississippi. Well, part of paying the war debt was to surrender what's now Alabama and Mississippi to the federal government. That's all federal land grants. We're one of the originals. So you got to picture that these people are all trying to move all the way across. Even Virginia went all the way over. After the war, the Native Americans started ceding land to the state, And as fast as these things opened up, the counties started forming rapidly. So just in that short bit of time, we have a whole bunch of counties now. And the native lands targeted for settlement, records shift with the new counties. But what was first, well, the record was first established, it stays in that county. So like I said, the land that I'm searching for is Fulton, but I have to go to DeKalb for when it was DeKalb. My next stop is Henry County, you know. Major native land, more secessions, and the lottery lands replaced the head right. So there used to be a head right. You got so many acres based on how big your family was and how many people were there. Now they were doing the land lotteries. This was a fast way of getting the land taken up. And so the settlement started pushing west. And I want you to notice Early County because it's going to start changing real quick on you. Boom. Large counties subdivided repeatedly. Jurisdictions changed faster than the families could move sometimes. The record split across multiple successor counties is what I'm trying to say, just with the land that I'm looking here. And this is why missing records often still exist just somewhere else. And then there was the expansion beyond Georgia. So people started moving west. So by 1820, we were opening up with all these new territories, and the veterans and their families followed the land opportunities. So, like I said, mentioned one that wound up in Illinois. This family, the Vierdens, and it was another Gordon family. I mean, they intermarried so much. I'm wondering if some of it was breaking laws. But two Vierdon brothers moved to Missouri, and then one moved to Illinois, where his brother-in-law, the Gordon, was. And like I said, the families were very close. But this is where things get interesting. The one that stayed in Missouri was illiterate. Vierdon, V-I-R-D-E-N, became V-I-R-G-I-N. It's virgin. Because they didn't know how to spell, and over time, the name morphed. They're the same family. Keep that in mind. Sometimes you're dealing with people that were illiterate, didn't know how to spell, and their name gets spelled wrong. But by the way, when I first started researching Gilshot, probably 24 ways that name was spelled, including Guild, the Speaker's Guild, Shaw, and Shot. And, look for various spellings when you're doing your research. So now records are being found far from the original residents, far from where this stuff took place. Federal records replaced the state in some cases. Those who filed for pensions, that was all federal. Now, if you get the handouts, there's one more act that just didn't fill on the slide. That was more for the widows. But this is when the Pension Act started. So, Gilshot Thomas had 6 children. We know that for a fact. We got documenting 5 of the 6 children. Kid number 5, we're still trying to prove, is my ancestor, James Thomas. We're pretty darn confident it is, but I'm in the process of eliminating all the other James Thomases so that he's the last one standing. But he served with his brother in the South Carolina militia. But he died in 1835 before he's really entitled to a pension. So this is why there might not be pension records. This is why this is an important thing with the handouts to keep in mind, because we want pension records. By the way, I have seen 2 pension records applications that listed all the children and when they were born. It helped with the Vierdon case, didn't help with my other one. If you find one of those in your ancestry, go buy a lottery ticket. I mean, that is rare. I'm going to put all this stuff together as we're finding it. The Revolutionary War service may not be a one record. The proof is built by layering all the evidence. I mean, one of them I've been working on is William Day. I know he served. He's from Central Virginia. I just can't figure out where. And there's happens to be another William Day that lives in the next county over. The context explains some of these contradictions. So misalignment is normal. It's not a red flag. It's just the context turns the conflicts into explanations as you start digging and researching. Conclusions must follow the records, not assumptions. I tell people It's easy sometimes to make your ancestry fit your goal, but it's wrong. Again, I could join SAR tomorrow on my James Thomas because he's in there. I won't because I want to prove it by the proper standards, not by folklore of a now deceased distant cousin of mine who got mad when I suggested there was a junior. So the legend was that Gilshot Thomas and his son James served in the American Revolution. Keep in mind, they didn't know Junior even existed. And that clearly says Gilshot. This is his pay sheet from South Carolina. This is the backside. You know how a lot of those papers are trifold?
Yeah.
Flip it over, Gil Thomas, not Gilshot. That's my proof that it was Gilshot Jr. that served in the South Carolina militia along with James. Now, if I could go by signature, James' signature, James was illiterate, Gilshot wasn't. James's signature, when he got his pay in 1782, is identical to when he was a church clerk in 1820. But you have to read every word. The point is, every word on every piece of paper, flip it over, turn it around. You know, sometimes you find some of these downstairs, and because it was trifold, it's written a little bit this way, a little bit this way, a little bit this way. You know, flip it around, read it. From people to proof, heroes and ordinary people leave different records. So we don't have anything on our James that, like I said, directly ties him to the one search South Carolina gets the signature now. But we have to build these cases. Watch out for same name individuals. There were 6 James Thomases living in Georgia and served in the Revolutionary War in one capacity or another. I've ruled out 2. One's the wrong age, one was born in Virginia. The allegiance may have changed. Now, if they were Patriot, Loyalist, they came back to being a Patriot, and you can prove it, you can use that for DAR and SAR. Absence itself could be evidence to what was going on. The proof is cumulative. It's rare that it's just a single piece of paper. Even with my Gordon Virden, I had to prove, you know, they started in South Carolina, then they were in Warren County, Georgia, then Missouri and Illinois. You know, you have to follow them along and get all the records. The geography explains why the records, and like I said, the counties change so fast, that's where some of the stuff gets lost. And we've got so many burnt counties and disasters. The last pages of the handout, I borrowed from the archives. They've got the originals downstairs if you want to go get a clean copy of courthouse disasters. Fortunately, the one in Rome just earlier this year, no records were in the old courthouse. They're all in the new courthouse. So we didn't lose anything there. But many years ago down in Albany, flooding took out records. So, you know, we've had our share, more than our fair share.
Don't forget.
Oh, yeah. Well, Burke County is considered the most burnt county. It was first burnt by the Tories during the war. So veterans often settle far from where they served. Pension Acts drove where the evidence appears. You got to understand the Pension Act. And research has to follow, again, the individual. Follow the individual, follow the family. And Georgia's experience is unique. I mean, the only thing that was unique was how young we were. Frontier conditions repeat across all the states. The loyalists and refugees and migrants exist everywhere. So you're going to find this pattern. What I'm saying is, if your research is in Georgia, it's the same process you're going to follow in the other colonies. And the approach scales to any state or period. Last takeaways, context can turn fragments into evidence. When you get a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here. So, and one of my key things when I'm teaching basic research is don't trust an abstract if you can get your hands on the original. It had me on a 2-year goose chase because Gilshot Jr. sold the land that his father, Gilshot Thomas, was still living on in Delaware. Was the abstract. Finally, I got smart and pulled the original. I was like, no, Dad's dead too, you know? Research succeeds when the questions are framed correctly. You got to ask the right questions. You got to set your mind on a specific target of what you're looking for. And the story is in the records if you let them speak. And some of these people that just served in the Revolutionary War have some terrific stories. Georgia 250 uncovering, so we were a late colony. We didn't go to the First Continental Congress as a state. Again, it was because they liked Governor Wright. Then there was a rapid change very quickly in the fragmented jurisdiction. So when we apply all of this back to Georgia, especially a late frontier colony, we can finally make sense of why the records look the way they do. And they've got a lot of records downstairs. Go find them. That's your job. Don't you hire me. Boy, you didn't wait a second there to ask a question. Yes, ma'am.
Presentation. See that on here? Presentation. Yeah, we're Indian, Blacks, and Indians, and I'm from Georgia. I've been researching for quite a while. And my family is from Georgia. They were in Georgia around that time of their revolution. I know that a lot of records were destroyed, probably not kept by the Indians and Blacks on the Indians and Blacks. Did Blacks and Indians serve in the American Revolution? Have you ever seen a pension plan around that time for a Black person if they were recorded? Were the records kept about them serving?
Very little records have been found in Georgia of Black serving.
You have any knowledge of whether or not they did serve?
Dabney
Dabney did. There were some, but he's the only one that I can speak of. Okay. I'm not aware of. And I haven't really looked into whether or to what extent the Native Americans supported the revolution.
Okay, I thought maybe, because during my research, I see stuff that doesn't necessarily pertain to what I'm looking for. So I just.
Yeah. Sure.
Mhm.
Hey, Mary, thank you so much for your presentation. I just kind of want to follow up on some of your points and also to answer her question as well. I've been researching Georgia for over 30 years as well because I'm tied to the coast.
Me too.
And I got to appreciate how you did the history tied in the sound genealogical methodology. But part of the problem with the Revolutionary War era is that we're property. So we're in the records. They're owners. And I want to bring up specifically how you did the cluster research, basically, and records. We're all tied up into that because as you were talking about McIntosh, I found a lot on the McIntosh family because these are my DNA matches, and my family's from McIntosh family. So it comes out gradually. And in the case of, you mentioned Governor Wright, one of the key people that we need to talk about is a man named Kwamino Dolly. He was the Kwamino Dolly, and he is the manservant of Governor Wright, and he is responsible for the sacking of Savannah. He was a loyalist, ended up telling because he knew the waterways, and so everybody talks about education. This man was educated and knowledgeable about the lakes and the waterways. He led the British in. He got paid well enough that he purchased his own freedoms, and that of his family members. It's all on record. He had wives. Their lives are more interesting than his. But what I found with Kwamino, there is an illustration of him in the Augusta courthouse. So, we're there. In these records, like you said, you have to go to the counties and even the deep records here in the archives and just follow the owners. But, a story is unfolding, and I'm getting ready to do that presentation alone, a standalone on Kwamino, because, I was just fascinated. But there also, you got to consider the main soldiers that also served. There's statues of them in Savannah today. But they served, and they're key to the liberation efforts here in Georgia. So they're like little kids, but they're just not outright. And that's an issue for us as we do this research.
I'm all the way back to like the early 1800s, to the early 1800s. And I thought I would find them as servants too, but they weren't listed as servants. They're listed with skills.
Yeah. And that's the unknown.
Maybe that's to respect the news had for them, or they were literate enough
A
to.
lot of them were literate. Yeah.
Okay.
They couldn't come out and say, somebody said somebody was gonna pay the cost of, educating. So, yeah, but a lot of them were literate. And again, this Georgia to me, is one thing I was gonna kind of push back on you in terms of, comparing us to the rest of the nation. I think we're very, very unique. And there are a lot of firsts that people are unaware of that Georgia that kind of spread out. But I think it's one of the most interesting states,
Nice.
to research. And I think we're just scratching the surface, but we're getting there with all the digitization and all the things that are offered here at the archives. And
And my people never left.
yeah,
You know how some either ran away or moved away? But I'm back to my 3 times great grandfather, and everybody is right there in the same county with the burn.
which county?
That's gonna be.
So yeah, mine started off in Hancock as well, and migrated down to Hancock. Yeah, so we're probably, you definitely.
Anybody else have any questions?
How much information was left about the Indian people during those times? Because my dad's grandmother was Cherokee. And I'm not sure how hard it'll be to find her.
I haven't done a whole lot of research, like I said, on the Native Americans. What little I've done is by clients wanting to find out, and you go to the Dawes roll and the other rolls, and if the name's not on it,
What county? Because I have established a notebook. I've researched.
It was up north, it was in, LJ. That's Jasper County, isn't it? Gilmer.
I'm not sure
And
where that is. I
Bartow.
was raised in Florida, so I'm not sure where that is in regards to Hancock, but I have established a notebook.
Oh, good.
So if you'd like to exchange numbers, I
Sure.
frequent this area, this.
Okay.
Investors sometimes come.
Nice.
And go to that.
Deborah.
My question becomes to you is, was your ancestors actually in Georgia or South Carolina or Tennessee? Because the Cherokee was really prominent in, not in Georgia.
Right.
But above, yes.
Okay. I just know stories.
The other thing, on the indigenous,
Creek was here.
Creek was here, yeah. But then talking about the indigenous again, we've got a situation in which their identities are muddled over,
Right. Right.
because, it's a really complex history where, you have the 5 civilized tribes basically, also becoming slave owners as well. And then, identities,
Yes.
and identities will change. And then, even as late as 1924, Virginia passes a law by a man named Fleckler, who basically decided to take any people of any minorities and counted them as a Black.
What?
Yeah, and so there's an excellent book by a man named in Irish. His family got swept up and counted as Black.
Wow.
But also.
Yeah, I did
If
find
they-
one
if
record
they-
where my
they-
ancestor was listed as Irish. I think it's because whites. Right, and all the whites were Irish. Yeah,
Very seldom were they
So,
Indian.
yeah, so when
And
you
I don't even know her husband.
when you look at marginalized populations, and then also there were instances where property was doled out, at one time to indigenous people. Some white Americans filed themselves as indigenous to take advantage and to acquire property. So we've got a real muddled history there. You gotta talk about it.
Somebody else seems surprised that the Native Americans owned slaves.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know that they were not freed under the Emancipation Proclamation. They were not freed under the 14th Amendment. They were not freed till much later. No, it was in the 1800s. But a lot of those enslaved became members of the tribe with all rights and privileges.
yeah.
Upon the individual as to how they actually related to the runaway slaves or the blacks that came in. And it wasn't that all of the tribes made slaves out of them, it just depended on the individual. And that's what Black Indian.
Where's it?
And then
Let's wrap this up though, okay? Anybody else have any questions on this presentation? Good.
Right.
Thank you.
I do have one.
All right, we got a question.
Okay, the American Revolution pensions, are those Georgia archives or in the federal?
If they got the pension, that was NARA. The pension application had to go to NARA. So it's federal, yeah. But you might find some of the writings here because they had, when they filed a pension, they had to get, you're my neighbor, you know me for 20 years, right? Right, that I'm a good dude, you know? So some of those things may be low. All right, thank you all, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
No problem.